Eve Wilkowitz was a 20-year-old woman living in Long Island, New York in 1980. At that time, she worked as a secretary in Manhattan, building her daily routine around her work and commute. On the 22nd of March 1980, Eve traveled home to Bay Shore after leaving work in Manhattan. She took a Long Island Railroad train as part of her journey home. After arriving at the train station, Eve still had to walk the remaining distance to her home. This was the last known movement documented before she disappeared. The information available about that evening focuses on her travel from the station and the fact that she never completed that walk home. Eve's case would later become a homicide investigation, but at this point, the known details begin with her routine journey and the events that followed her departure from the railroad station. 3 days later, investigators discovered her body, marking the beginning of an investigation into what had happened to her after she left the station. The early details of Eve Wilkowitz's life before the crime provide the foundation for understanding the timeline of the case. She was identified through these basic facts: her age, her home in Long Island, her job in Manhattan, and her final known trip home on the 22nd of March 1980. These details established the beginning of the investigation and introduced the circumstances surrounding her disappearance without adding details beyond the known record. The following events would reveal the tragic discovery that changed the direction of events. Eve never made it home after leaving the train station on the 22nd of March 1980. 3 days later, investigators discovered her body, and the case immediately became a homicide investigation. The discovery marked the beginning of an effort to understand what happened after Eve had completed her train journey to Bay Shore and began the walk home that she would never finish. Investigators determined that Eve had been strangled and assaulted. During the examination of the case, investigators collected male DNA from her body. This biological evidence belonged to the person responsible for her death. However, even though investigators had recovered DNA evidence connected to the crime, they were unable to identify the individual linked to that evidence for many years. The DNA profile became a significant part of the investigation because it provided investigators with information connected to the person responsible while still leaving the suspect's identity unknown. The case remained unresolved despite the existence of biological evidence collected during the investigation. For years, investigators faced the challenge of having a DNA profile connected to the crime, but no identified suspect. The evidence existed, but the person connected to it could not be named. This stage of the investigation would later become important as advances in DNA technology changed how investigators approached the case. The collected DNA evidence would eventually provide a path toward identifying the person responsible for Eve's death and would eventually allow investigators to revisit the case after decades of unanswered questions through new methods of analysis. After years without an identification in Eve Wilkowitz's case, investigators were eventually able to use the DNA evidence collected from the investigation to create a profile of the unknown suspect. The DNA profile provided investigators with a new opportunity to continue searching for the person connected to Eve's death. The next step involves submitting the DNA profile into public DNA databases. Investigators used these resources to look for possible connections that could help identify the individual behind the evidence. Through this process, they were able to find a connection that would eventually move the investigation forward. In 2022, investigators identified the son of the suspected individual after the son had entered his DNA information into a public genealogical website. This development provided investigators with a possible path toward identifying the person connected to the DNA profile created from the case. Investigators then contacted and interviewed the son as part of their continued investigation. During this process, the son provided a DNA sample to investigators. After additional testing and analysis, investigators became convinced that Herbert Rice was the person they had been searching for. The identification of Herbert Rice represented a major development in the investigation after more than 4 decades without an identified suspect. The process showed how advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to revisit evidence collected many years earlier and use new methods to create connections that were not previously possible. The breakthrough did not come from new evidence at the crime scene, but from the continued examination of existing DNA evidence and the use of modern investigative resources. Through DNA analysis and genealogical connections, investigators were able to move closer to resolving the case and identifying the person responsible for Eve Wilkowitz's death. Discovery provided investigators with answers after decades while bringing new attention to DNA evidence. Herbert Rice was identified as the individual connected to the DNA evidence collected in Eve Wilkowitz's case, but investigators faced an important limitation. He was no longer alive when they reached this point in the investigation. Herbert Rice had died in 1991 from cancer. At the time of Eve's murder in 1980, Rice was 29 years old. Investigators also determined that Rice had lived with his mother near the location where Eve's body was discovered. Because Rice had already passed away, investigators could not conduct a traditional investigation involving an interview with him or directly question him about the case. Instead, investigators took an additional step by exhuming his body. Genetic analysis was then performed on Rice's DNA to compare it with the evidence connected to Eve's death. The results confirmed that Herbert Rice was the person responsible for Eve's death. The confirmation process provided investigators with the final evidence needed to identify the individual linked to the DNA profile after decades of uncertainty. The case had remained unresolved for many years, but advances in DNA analysis allowed investigators to examine existing evidence and establish a connection that was not previously possible. The investigation did not include information about Rice's motives or any additional details beyond the confirmed findings. Instead, investigators focused on the evidence that connected him to the crime and the process used to confirm his identity. This final stage of the investigation showed how authorities were able to resolve the case despite the passage of more than 4 decades and the fact that the identified suspect had died years earlier. Through genetic testing and careful examination of the available evidence, investigators reached a conclusion supported by DNA analysis. The findings brought an official identification in a case that had remained unsolved for many years before Rice's connection. Late March 2022, authorities held a press conference to announce the update in Eve Wilkowitz's case after decades without an identified suspect. Investigators publicly shared the results of their DNA investigation and confirmed the identity of Herbert Rice. The announcement marked the conclusion of a long process that involved examining DNA evidence and using new investigative methods to identify the person connected to Eve's death. During the press conference, Eve's sister, Irene Wilkowitz, spoke about seeing the face of the man responsible for taking her sister's life. Irene explained that it was her first time seeing him. She also said that although she had known his name for a couple of months, she had chosen not to search for him online. Irene's decision was based on not wanting to see the last face Eve saw while she was still alive. Her statement reflected the emotional impact of finally learning the identity of the person responsible after many years of uncertainty. The announcement provided answers that had remained unknown for decades and allowed Eve's family to know who had been connected to her death. Prosecutors also explained that they did not believe Eve and Rice knew each other. According to investigators, the crime was believed to be an opportunity-based incident rather than one involving a previous relationship between the victim and suspect. The findings showed that the investigation reached a final stage through DNA analysis, confirmed the identity of the individual connected to the evidence collected in Eve's case. The press conference represented a significant moment for investigators and Eve's family, as the case moved from an unresolved investigation to a confirmed identification after many years. The information presented remained focused on the evidence and the conclusions reached through the investigative process without adding details beyond the confirmed case findings. The investigation into Eve Wilkowitz's death reached a resolution after decades of unanswered questions through the use of modern DNA methods. Investigators reviewed evidence collected from the original investigation and used new techniques to identify the person connected to the DNA profile. The case began in 1980, when Eve disappeared after leaving the Long Island Railroad station while traveling home to Bay Shore. 3 days later, investigators discovered her body and collected male DNA evidence that would become central to the investigation for many years. Although the DNA evidence was available, investigators were unable to identify the source of the profile until advances in technology provided new opportunities for analysis. Investigators eventually created a DNA profile of the unknown suspect and submitted it into public genealogical databases to search for possible connections. This process led to the identification of Herbert Rice's son, who had entered his DNA information into a public genealogical website. After investigators contacted and interviewed him, he provided a DNA sample for further testing. The additional analysis convinced investigators that Herbert Rice was the person connected to the DNA evidence collected in Eve's case. Investigators then exhumed Rice's remains, and genetic analysis confirmed the match between his DNA and the evidence connected to the crime. The investigation ultimately identified the person responsible for Eve's death and provided answers in a case that had remained unresolved for many years. The resolution demonstrated how DNA analysis helped investigators revisit existing evidence and reach a confirmed identification after decades passed. Emma Caldwell was a 7-year-old woman living in Glasgow, Scotland. In 2005, at the time, Emma worked as a sex worker in Glasgow's red light district, a part of the city where she was known to be living before the events that led to the investigation. The available information about Emma's life during this period is limited to these details, and this account focuses only on the confirmed facts surrounding her case. In 2005, Emma was living in Glasgow when she became the focus of a missing person investigation. She was last seen on the 4th of April, 2005. This date marked the beginning of the timeline that would later lead investigators to examine the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and death. No additional details about her personal life, relationships, or activities before her disappearance are provided in the available information, and the investigation timeline remains centered on the documented events connected to the case. Emma's disappearance became the starting point for an investigation that would continue for many years. The information available establishes her identity as a woman from Glasgow and records that she was working in the city's red light district before she was last seen on the 4th of April, 2005. This was the final confirmed sighting of Emma before the later discovery of her body and the beginning of further investigative efforts. The early information in the case provides the foundation for understanding who Emma was, where she lived, and the circumstances surrounding the start of the investigation. This section establishes the basic timeline before examining the discovery of her body and the work carried out by investigators. The details presented remain limited to the facts available, ensuring the account follows the documented information about Emma Caldwell and the initial stage of the case without assumptions or unsupported claims in the narrative. Emma Caldwell's disappearance became the beginning of a long investigation after she was last seen on April 4, 2005. 5 weeks later, her body was discovered approximately 40 miles away in Woodland, near South Lanarkshire. The discovery led to a police response as investigators arrived at the location to examine the crime scene and begin documenting the circumstances surrounding what had happened. Following the discovery of Emma's body, investigators worked to collect forensic evidence from the scene. The evidence-gathering process was part of the wider effort to understand the events connected to Emma's death and disappearance. Police also began examining information available to them and interviewing potential suspects as they attempted to identify leads that could help solve the case. The location where Emma's body was found became an important part of the investigation as officers continued their work to establish the facts surrounding the case. Investigators focused on the documented evidence and information collected during their inquiries, while attempting to determine what details could provide answers about Emma's disappearance. At this stage of the investigation, authorities were focused on gathering evidence, reviewing information, and following investigative procedures connected to the discovery of Emma's body. The early response established the foundation for the investigation that would continue as police worked to understand the circumstances surrounding the case. The confirmed timeline moved from Emma's final sighting to the discovery of her body and the beginning of official investigative efforts. No additional details beyond the available information are included, keeping the account focused on the documented events surrounding Emma Caldwell's disappearance and the initial police response. The investigation remains centered on the facts available to authorities as they continued examining the circumstances surrounding Emma's case and seeking information that could assist in understanding the events that led to the discovery made. Following the discovery of Emma Caldwell's body, investigators continued their work to understand the circumstances surrounding the case. Police collected forensic evidence from the crime scene and interviewed potential suspects as part of their efforts to find answers. These early investigative steps were focused on gathering information and examining available evidence connected to Emma's disappearance and death. During the initial investigation, authorities worked to identify leads that could help explain what had happened. However, despite the evidence collected and the interviews conducted, no significant leads emerged. The investigation reached a point where progress stalled, and the case eventually became a cold case. The lack of a clear breakthrough meant that the questions surrounding Emma's death remained unresolved for many years. The investigation remained inactive until later efforts brought renewed attention to the case. The original work carried out by investigators in 2005, including evidence collection and interviews, formed the foundation of the case record that would later be reviewed again. The challenges faced during the early years demonstrated the difficulty of moving the investigation forward without additional developments or significant leads. Although investigators had conducted work and followed investigative procedures, the case remained unresolved for years. The timeline of Emma Caldwell's case moved from the initial investigation in 2005 toward the eventual decision to revisit the circumstances surrounding her death in 2015. This period represented a significant stage in the case history, connecting the early efforts of investigators with the later reinvestigation. The later review of the case would become the next stage in the investigation as authorities examined the circumstances again. This process followed years, during which the case had remained without resolution, and reflected continued efforts to seek answers through official investigative work. The documented timeline shows how the case progressed from its original investigation toward future developments. Emma Caldwell's case was reopened in 2015, marking a new phase in the investigation after years without resolution. The case was reconsidered following review by senior lawyers within the Crown Office and after campaigning efforts by Emma's mother, Margaret Caldwell. The reopening of the investigation created an opportunity for authorities to examine the circumstances surrounding Emma's death and disappearance once again. Following the review, investigators continued working on the case and examined the available information connected to Emma's death. The renewed investigation focused on revisiting the unanswered questions that remained after the original investigation had become unresolved. Margaret Caldwell's continued campaigning for justice was also part of the efforts that kept attention on Emma's case during the years before the reinvestigation. The review represented a significant development in the timeline because it allowed authorities to return to the circumstances surrounding the case and continue investigative work. The process involved further examination of the details already connected to Emma's disappearance and death, while investigators continued seeking information that could assist the investigation. After the case was reopened, authorities continued their work over several years. The reinvestigation remained focused on understanding the circumstances surrounding Emma's case and reviewing the information available to investigators. This period created the connection between the earlier investigation and the later developments that would follow in the case. The renewed efforts eventually led toward further progress in 2022, when a significant development occurred in the investigation. Until that point, authorities had continued examining the circumstances of Emma's death and disappearance through the reinvestigation process. The reopening of the case showed that the investigation had moved beyond the original period of uncertainty and entered a new stage of official review. Investigators continued their efforts to examine the case while maintaining focus on the circumstances surrounding Emma's death and disappearance. In February 2022, a major development occurred in Emma Caldwell's case when a man was arrested in connection with the investigation. The arrested individual was identified in the available information as 9-year-old Ian Parker. The arrest followed years of renewed investigative work after the case had been reopened in 2015. As authorities continued examining the circumstances surrounding Emma's death and disappearance, Senior Investigating Officer Graham Mackey said that Police Scotland officers had undertaken a significant amount of work while reinvestigating all circumstances surrounding Emma's case, following instruction from the Lord Advocate. His statement described the investigation as complex and challenging, while acknowledging the efforts of everyone involved in reaching the point where an arrest was made. The investigation continued after the arrest, and the available information does not provide any conclusion regarding the outcome of the case. The arrest represented a significant stage in the timeline of the investigation, but it did not mark the end of official efforts connected to Emma Caldwell's case. During this period, officers remained in close contact with Emma's family, particularly her mother, Margaret Caldwell. Police updated Margaret regarding the significant development in the investigation and continued communication with her throughout the process. Graham Mackey also paid tribute to the work carried out by those involved in the reinvestigation. He thanked everyone who contributed to bringing the investigation to this stage, while recognizing the complexity of the case. The continued investigative efforts showed that authorities were still examining the circumstances surrounding Emma Caldwell's death and disappearance. No claims about guilt, evidence, or court outcomes are included, as the available information only confirms the arrest and the ongoing investigation. The focus remained on the continued work of investigators as they reviewed the circumstances connected to the case. Police Scotland's efforts involved examining the information available during the reinvestigation process while maintaining contact with the family. The February 2022 arrest became another important point in the timeline of Emma Caldwell's case history. Following the 2022 arrest in Emma Caldwell's case, her family continued to seek information that could assist the investigation. Solicitor Amour Anwar read a statement on behalf of Emma's family during a media briefing alongside her mother, Margaret Caldwell. The statement expressed gratitude toward detectives from Police Scotland and the Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain's team for their work in reinvestigating Emma's case. The statement also paid tribute to Margaret Caldwell for her determination and continued efforts to seek justice for her daughter. This recognition was presented through the words shared during the media briefing and focused on her ongoing involvement in efforts connected to the case. No additional personal details or motivations beyond the provided information are included, keeping the account focused on the documented response from Emma's family. After the arrest, the investigation remained ongoing as authorities continued seeking information related to Emma Caldwell's death. Emma's family urged anyone with information, regardless of how insignificant they believed it might be, to come forward and speak with Police Scotland. This request reflected the continued effort to gather information that could assist investigators as they examined the circumstances surrounding the case. The conclusion of this stage in the timeline did not represent the end of the investigation. Authorities continued their work while seeking information connected to Emma Caldwell's death. The case remained under investigation, with Police Scotland continuing efforts to examine the circumstances surrounding what happened. The final focus remained on the ongoing search for answers and the continued cooperation between investigators, Emma's family, and anyone who might provide relevant information about the case. The investigation continued as authorities reviewed available information and worked through the established process connected to Emma's case. The family's request for assistance remained part of the ongoing effort to find further information about the circumstances involved. On the 19th of April, 1991, 5-year-old Joy Hibbs was living with her husband, Charlie Hibbs, and their 2 children, Angie and David, in Croydon, Pennsylvania. That afternoon, shortly after 1 p.m., 2-year-old David returned home from school and found the family house engulfed in flames. Believing his mother was still inside, he immediately ran for help as emergency responders rushed to the scene. Firefighters entered the burning home and eventually located Joy's body inside David's bedroom. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with a tragic accidental house fire. Inside the kitchen, they found 4 gas burners on the stove turned on, adding to the intensity of the blaze and appearing consistent with a devastating fire. That initial conclusion changed after the autopsy was completed. Medical examiners determined that Joy had died before the fire began. Their findings showed she had been stabbed 5 times, strangled, and severely beaten. Investigators also discovered that a computer cord had been wrapped around her upper torso. These injuries clearly established that her death was the result of a violent assault rather than the fire itself. As investigators compared the autopsy findings with the condition of the scene, they concluded that the fire had been intentionally set after Joy's death. What first appeared to be an accidental residential fire was now recognized as an effort to conceal a homicide. From that point forward, the investigation shifted away from determining the cause of a fire and toward identifying the person responsible for Joy Hibbs' killing and the deliberate burning of the family home afterward. With much of the physical evidence destroyed by the fire, investigators turned to witness accounts and documented records to reconstruct Joy Hibbs' final known movements. They concluded the blaze had been deliberately set in an effort to destroy forensic evidence that might have identified the person responsible. The fire marshal determined there were 4 separate points where the fire had originated, and at least one of those locations showed indications that an accelerant had likely been used, reinforcing the conclusion that the fire was intentionally started. Investigators then established a timeline using Joy's routine activities on the morning of the 19th of April, 1991. Records showed she first cashed her paycheck at the bank before stopping to buy groceries, following her normal Friday schedule. She returned home at approximately 11 a.m. A neighbor later reported seeing Joy outside walking the family's new puppy, Major, providing another confirmed point in the timeline. Sometime after 11 a.m., 2 members of the Bensalem Baptist Church visited the Hibbs residence. They stopped by to discuss Joy joining the congregation and remained only briefly before leaving sometime before noon. Their visit became another important reference point as investigators narrowed the time frame surrounding the crime. Inside the damaged home, investigators found additional details that complicated the case. Joy's wallet was recovered from the cushions of the living room couch, but the cash was gone. Her purse was discovered on the kitchen floor with its contents scattered. Although these findings suggested robbery could have been a motive, Investigators questioned whether the extreme violence of the killing, followed by the deliberate setting of the fire, was likely committed solely for the relatively small amount of money missing. Bristol Township Police broadened the investigation by speaking with nearly everyone who had known Joy Hibbs. Detectives interviewed her employer, friends, relatives, neighbors, and other acquaintances, hoping someone might provide information that explained why she had been targeted. Instead, interview after interview painted a remarkably consistent picture of her character. Those who knew Joy described her as well-liked and devoted to her family. They also shared details about her background, explaining that she had grown up in Central Florida as the youngest of 9 children. Friends and relatives remembered her enjoying camping, hiking, fishing, gardening, and preparing fried okra for those around her. As the investigation continued, detectives examined Charlie Hibbs, following the standard practice of closely evaluating a victim's spouse in homicide cases. Investigators learned that Joy and Charlie had been high school sweethearts and had celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary less than a week before her death. They found no indication of problems within the marriage. Charlie's co-workers confirmed that he had been working at a job site in Philadelphia when the crime occurred, providing investigators with a solid alibi. A neighbor also reported an unusual sight from that day: a dark-colored Chevrolet Monte Carlo parked unusually close to the curb, directly outside the Hibbs residence at the T intersection. Although it seemed like a small detail at first, investigators later viewed the observation as potentially significant. Attention also turned to Robert Atkins, who occasionally sold marijuana to Joy. The autopsy had determined that Joy had smoked marijuana on the morning of the fire. Detectives learned that Joy and Atkins had argued over the quality of marijuana he sold because he refused to issue a refund. Despite those circumstances, investigators did not have enough evidence to prove his involvement. The investigation remained unresolved for many years before being assigned to Bristol Township Detective Michael Slaughter in 2014. He reviewed the original investigative files and reopened the case by interviewing officers and witnesses connected to the 1,991 investigation. His renewed review focused on identifying overlooked details and reassessing earlier statements. Slaughter identified Robert Atkins and his former wife April Atkins as persons of interest. During an unexpected interview in 2014, April said police had never questioned her about Robert despite his claimed alibi, placing their family in the Poconos during the weekend of Joy's death. She said they traveled there with their children and learned about Joy's death only after returning home. Slaughter later interviewed Robert Atkins. During that interview, Atkins admitted he had served as a confidential informant for Bristol Township Police in 1991. He acknowledged using methamphetamine and obtaining drugs for other people, but said he did not consider himself a drug dealer. Atkins also admitted arguing with Joy over the marijuana transaction, but denied threatening her or her family. Atkins told Slaughter that he left Bristol Township around noon on the day of the fire for the Poconos with his wife and children. He maintained that police had previously confirmed his hotel stay and verified his alibi through another witness connected to his wife. He continued to deny any involvement in Joy's death. He insisted the disagreement over marijuana never became a violent confrontation and repeated that his account remained unchanged throughout the interview with Detective Slaughter. After the 2014 interviews, Detective Michael Slaughter continued reviewing the case and uncovered additional information connected to Robert Atkins. Former Bristol Township Police Chief Tom Mills confirmed that Atkins had been working as a confidential informant for the department in 1991. According to Mills, Atkins purchased methamphetamine and marijuana as part of that role, providing investigators with further context about his activities during the period when Joy Hibbs was killed. Mills also recalled first interviewing Atkins 2 days after Joy's death, after receiving instructions to contact him before his name surfaced during the investigation. Mills and another detective went to Atkins' apartment, but Atkins refused to allow them inside. During that visit, Mills noticed a dark-colored Monte Carlo parked at the apartment complex, a detail that matched the earlier witness description of a similar vehicle seen near the Hibbs residence on the day of the crime. A major development came in 2016 when April Atkins voluntarily returned to the Bristol Township Police Station to speak with Detective Slaughter. She stated that on the day Joy died, her former husband arrived home covered in blood. According to April, he confessed that he had stabbed someone and set a house on fire. She said he instructed her to call off work, pack their children, and leave immediately for the Poconos, where the family remained for 2 days. April also explained why she had not revealed this information during her 2014 interview. She told investigators she had stayed silent because she feared for the safety of her youngest child, who was still living with Robert Atkins at that time. Investigators continued examining Robert Atkins' claimed alibi. In 2021, detectives interviewed the former coworker, whom Atkins had identified decades earlier as someone who could verify his whereabouts. According to investigators, she acknowledged speaking with police in 1991. After Atkins provided her contact information, she reported that when she telephoned the Atkins residence between approximately 1 p.m. and 1:30 p.m. on the 19th of April, 1991, Robert Atkins answered the phone. In May 2022, 56-year-old Robert Atkins was charged in connection with Joy Hibbs' death. He was arraigned before Judge Frank Parenteau Sr. in Bristol and ordered held without bail at the Bucks County Correctional Center. The Bucks County District Attorney's Office then held a news conference announcing the arrest. District Attorney Matt Weintraub described the development as a gratifying moment that brought closure to the Hibbs family after more than 3 decades. During the conference, Weintraub read a statement on behalf of the family. They described Joy as a sweet, charming Southern woman and a devoted wife and mother. The statement said the family had waited 31 years for justice. Authorities also emphasized that the investigation remained active and encouraged anyone with additional information to contact investigators. They stated that any new information could still assist the ongoing investigation and help clarify remaining questions connected to the case. Investigators continued seeking information from anyone who might remember relevant events, conversations, observations, or circumstances surrounding the 19th of April, 1991. They asked potential witnesses to come forward and speak with detectives handling the investigation directly. In January 1999, 28-year-old Mika Wadley was living in Richmond, California. One evening, a neighbor heard screaming coming from Mika's home on the 1300 block of Carlson Boulevard. Concerned by the sounds, the neighbor walked to her residence and knocked on the front door. The screaming continued for approximately 30 seconds after the knocking, but no one answered the door. With no response and the disturbance still causing concern, the neighbor returned to his apartment and called 911 to report what had been heard. Responding officers arrived at the residence shortly afterward and began checking the property. They found the front door locked. During their examination of the exterior, officers discovered that the back door was unlocked and partially open. They entered the home through that access point and conducted a search of the residence. Inside the bedroom, investigators found Mika Wadley's body lying on the floor. The documented findings at the scene showed that her hands had been bound together with shoelaces. Investigators also determined that she had been smothered. A large knife was located underneath her body. These observations formed the initial record of the crime scene and became central to the investigation that followed. Investigators immediately began processing the residence for evidence. During that work, they recovered DNA evidence and fingerprints belonging to an unknown suspect. Those physical findings established that identifiable forensic evidence existed from the very beginning of the investigation, even though the individual connected to that evidence had not yet been identified through the investigative process at that time. Following the discovery of Mika Wadley's body, detectives began the initial phase of the homicide investigation by identifying people who had recently been in contact with her. Their earliest efforts centered on reconstructing her final known interactions and determining whether anyone close to those events might provide answers. Investigators focused particular attention on a man who had spent the previous evening with Mika before her death. That lead received careful examination as detectives worked to establish whether the individual had any connection to the crime. After completing their investigation, authorities ruled him out as a suspect. According to the available information, no additional investigative leads remained once that determination was made. Although investigators had recovered DNA evidence and fingerprints from the crime scene, those forensic findings did not identify the person responsible at that time. Without viable suspects or new information to pursue, the investigation gradually lost momentum. Detectives continued reviewing the available evidence, but the absence of further leads prevented the case from moving forward. Over time, Mika Wadley's homicide became a cold case, despite the existence of biological evidence and fingerprint evidence collected during the original investigation. Even though the investigation had stalled, the evidence recovered from the residence was carefully preserved. Biological samples and fingerprint evidence remained available for future examination. As forensic science continued advancing over the years, those preserved materials remained an important part of the case, providing investigators with evidence that could later be examined using improved forensic techniques. In 2002, investigators conducted the first major forensic re-examination of the evidence collected during the investigation into Mika Wadley's homicide. Their work focused on biological material that had been preserved from the original crime scene. Using swabs collected from Mika's hands together with a bloodstain recovered at the residence, investigators developed a mixed DNA profile that could be used for additional forensic analysis. Once the profile was completed, it was submitted to the California Department of Justice for comparison against the state's offender DNA database. The purpose of the submission was straightforward. Investigators hoped the profile would match someone whose DNA had already been entered into the database through the offender identification system. A successful match could have identified the unknown individual connected to the biological evidence recovered at the crime scene. The database search, however, produced no matches. Although investigators possessed a usable DNA profile, the available records did not identify the person whose genetic material had been recovered. As a result, the forensic evidence could not be linked to a known individual through the database available at that time. Without a DNA match, the investigation remained unresolved. Detectives still lacked the information needed to identify the person responsible, despite the existence of biological evidence collected during the original investigation. Even so, the evidence itself remained preserved. As forensic science and DNA testing methods continued to improve over the years, those preserved samples remained available for future examination, allowing investigators the opportunity to revisit the case using advances that were not available during the earlier stages of the investigation. In 2020, more than 2 decades after Mika Wadley's homicide, investigators revisited the case as advances in forensic DNA analysis created new opportunities to examine evidence that had remained preserved since the original investigation. Rather than relying only on previously tested samples, investigators requested additional laboratory testing of evidence that had not been examined before. This renewed effort focused on Mika's fingernail clippings and the ligatures that had been used to bind her hands, with the goal of determining whether newer forensic techniques could recover additional biological evidence. The testing produced an important result. A male DNA profile was successfully developed from Mika's fingernail clippings. In October 2020, the Contra Costa County Crime Lab submitted that DNA profile to the California Department of Justice DNA Data Bank program, so investigators could conduct a familial search through the state DNA index system. Instead of seeking an exact database match, the search was intended to identify individuals who might be closely related to the unknown contributor. In April 2021, investigators received the results from the California Department of Justice's Bureau of Forensic Services and Bureau of Investigation. The familial search identified a person who appeared to be a potential first-degree relative of the unknown male contributor. Detectives investigated that lead, but the relative was ultimately ruled out as the suspect. Working with the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office, detectives continued following the familial evidence. They located another immediate relative, and in September 2021, investigators obtained a buccal swab from that individual. The sample was submitted for laboratory analysis and compared with the DNA profile developed from Mika's fingernail clippings. That comparison ultimately connected investigators to the individual whose DNA matched the recovered profile, setting the stage for the case's long-awaited resolution. On the 17th of September 2021, Richmond police received confirmation that the buccal swab obtained from an immediate relative had produced the long-awaited forensic breakthrough. Laboratory analysis established that Jerry Lee Henderson was the source of the DNA recovered from Mika Wadley's fingernail clippings. After more than 2 decades of investigation, advances in DNA testing had finally identified the individual connected to the biological evidence preserved from the crime scene. As investigators continued reviewing the case following the DNA confirmation, they learned that Henderson had died from an overdose only 11 days after Mika's death. Because he was no longer alive, no criminal prosecution could take place. Although the investigation had reached a definitive forensic conclusion, the legal process could not move forward against the identified individual. Even with that limitation, investigators regarded the DNA identification as a significant resolution to the case. The comparison answered the central investigative question that had remained unresolved for years by identifying the person whose DNA had been recovered from Mika's fingernail clippings. The preserved evidence, combined with modern forensic techniques, ultimately provided the answer that earlier investigative methods and database searches had been unable to deliver. Mika's family also shared that Henderson was known only as a friend of a friend. According to the information released, there was no other relationship between Henderson and Mika. Investigators did not provide additional details regarding any further connection, and no speculation formed part of the official findings. More than 20 years after the homicide, the DNA evidence ultimately resolved the central investigative question. Although the case could never proceed to prosecution because of Henderson's death, the forensic identification brought the investigation to its documented conclusion and established the identity of the individual connected to the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. Richmond police publicly announced the identification, expressing hope that the findings would provide some measure of closure for Mika's relatives after more than 20 years. California Attorney General Rob Bonta said law enforcement never gave up on the investigation and expressed hope that the resolution would bring Mika's family some peace. He acknowledged that nothing could bring Mika back, but emphasized authorities remained committed to uncovering the truth and pursuing justice. Acting Richmond Police Chief Louis Tarona also addressed the case. He expressed hope that the identification would bring closure to everyone who knew and loved Mika. His remarks reflected the department's belief that resolving the investigation, even after many years, could provide meaningful answers to those affected by her death. During the press conference, members of Mika's family also spoke about the outcome. Her sister, Quila Wadley, said that answers might not come today but would come tomorrow. Her words reflected continued faith that truth would eventually emerge. Mika's niece, Divine Peterson, remembered her aunt as beautiful, outgoing, smart, and someone who loved to hang out and have fun. She described Mika with affection while recalling the qualities her family continued to cherish. The public announcement marked the official resolution of the investigation based on the documented forensic findings. Although nothing could change the events of 1999, investigators expressed hope that identifying the source of the DNA evidence would provide lasting answers for Mika's loved ones. The documentary concludes with the official resolution announced by investigators and the family's reflections, remaining within the documented information provided about the case. The case remained a reminder that preserved evidence can retain investigative value across decades when examined with newer forensic methods. For Mika's relatives, the announcement represented documented answers after years of uncertainty, while honoring her memory through the confirmed investigation. Renee Blackmore was a 20-year-old Army private stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, during April 1982. At the time, she was serving in the military and living in the barracks assigned to her post. The known timeline of the case begins during that month, when she was last seen leaving her barracks. After that confirmed sighting, there were no immediate answers about what had happened to her, and her disappearance remained unresolved. As the search continued, investigators looked for evidence that could help determine Renee's whereabouts. About 1 month after she was last seen, an important discovery changed the direction of the investigation. In May 1982, Renee's wallet and sweater were found beside a road located a few miles from the Army post. Those personal belongings became the first significant pieces of evidence recovered after her disappearance and provided investigators with a specific area to examine more closely. The recovery of Renee's wallet and sweater established that her disappearance had left physical evidence behind. Investigators continued focusing their efforts around the location where the items had been discovered while attempting to determine what had happened after she left the barracks. Although the findings represented meaningful progress in the search, they did not immediately explain her disappearance or reveal her location. Instead, they marked an important point in the investigation, guiding authorities toward the next stage of their search as they continued following the available evidence and the established timeline of events. In June 1982, the search for Renee Blackmore reached a tragic conclusion when investigators discovered her body on a logging road located a few miles from the area where her wallet and sweater had previously been found. The discovery connected the earlier evidence to the location where the investigation would continue, providing authorities with a clearer understanding of the sequence of known events surrounding her disappearance. After examining the scene, investigators determined that someone had fatally shot Renee. That finding confirmed the case as a homicide and shifted the investigation toward identifying the individual responsible for her death. Law enforcement began an extensive investigation, collecting available evidence and pursuing leads that might establish who had committed the crime. Despite those investigative efforts, authorities were unable to gather enough evidence to identify or prosecute the person responsible during the early stages of the case. Although investigators continued working to resolve the homicide, The available evidence did not meet the threshold necessary for an arrest or successful prosecution at that time. As a result, the investigation remained open without reaching a resolution. Over the years that followed, the case continued as an unsolved homicide. Investigators maintained the understanding that someone was responsible for Renee Blackmore's death, but the identity of that person could not be established through sufficient evidence during that period. Without the evidence required to move the case forward in court, the investigation remained unresolved and ultimately became one of many long-term homicide investigations that stayed open for years, while authorities continued seeking answers through the available evidence and ongoing investigative review. In April 2022, the investigation into Renee Blackmore's killing reached its first major breakthrough. After approximately 4 decades, investigators announced the arrest of 4-year-old Marcellus McCluster in connection with the case, marking a significant development in a homicide that had remained unresolved since 1982. The announcement represented a major milestone for an investigation that had continued for many years without producing sufficient evidence to support criminal charges. At the time of his arrest, Marcellus McCluster was already serving a life sentence for an unrelated homicide. Investigators identified this as part of the official announcement, but did not discuss that unrelated case further while addressing the charges connected to Renee Blackmore's death. The focus remained on the long-running investigation that had finally progressed to an arrest after decades of unanswered questions. Authorities also disclosed that McCluster had always been considered a suspect during the investigation. According to investigators, they had never possessed enough evidence to make an arrest during the earlier stages of the case. Although suspicion had existed for years, officials explained that the available evidence had not previously met the standard required to move forward with criminal charges. Investigators did not reveal exactly what ultimately led to McCluster's arrest, and no public explanation was provided regarding the specific evidence that changed the course of the investigation. Instead, authorities limited their statements to confirming the arrest and acknowledging that the case had reached a long-awaited turning point. After nearly 40 years without an arrest, the announcement represented the first significant breakthrough in Renee Blackmore's homicide investigation and changed the status of the long-standing cold case. Following the announcement of Marcellus McCluster's arrest, Kimberly Schwartz, Assistant District Attorney for the Chattahoochee Judicial Circuit, publicly reflected on the lasting impact of Renee Blackmore's death. Her remarks focused not only on the progress in the investigation, but also on the life that ended long before its full potential could be realized. The statements placed the case within a broader human context, while remaining centered on the known facts. Schwartz noted that Renee never had the opportunity to celebrate her 21st birthday. She explained that no one would ever know who Renee might have loved, what relationships she might have built, or what dreams she might have achieved if her life had not been cut short. According to Schwartz, all of those possibilities were extinguished when Renee was fatally shot in South Chattahoochee County approximately 40 years earlier. Her comments emphasized the lasting consequences of a crime that affected far more than a single moment in time. During those remarks, Schwartz also stated that there is no expiration date on this kind of evil. The statement underscored the continuing commitment of law enforcement and prosecutors to unresolved homicide investigations, regardless of how many years have passed. Rather than presenting the arrest as the end of the story, her comments highlighted the importance of continuing efforts to seek accountability whenever sufficient evidence becomes available. Taken together, Schwartz's statements reflected both the significance of the arrest and the enduring loss experienced because of Renee Blackmore's death. They served as an official acknowledgement that the passage of 4 decades had not diminished the importance of the investigation. From that official perspective, attention then shifted toward Renee's family, whose experience reflected the personal cost of waiting 40 years for developments in the case. Donna Reitman, Renee Blackmore's mother, shared her perspective following the renewed progress in the investigation. She described Renee as a focused young woman who loved laughing and spending time with friends. Her statement offered a personal reflection on the daughter she lost while remaining closely connected to the official developments that finally brought movement to the case after many years without resolution. Reitman explained that she had lived for 40 years, carrying the pain caused by Renee's absence. During that time, she believed no one outside of their family and friends still cared about what had happened. According to her statement, that belief changed on the 28th of March 2022, when investigators demonstrated through their continued work that the case had never been forgotten. She expressed gratitude that the investigation had continued despite the passage of 4 decades. Although investigators announced the arrest of Marcellus McCluster, they have never publicly disclosed the specific evidence that ultimately led to that decision. Officials stated only that McCluster had always been considered a suspect during the investigation, but that sufficient evidence had not existed in earlier years to support an arrest. No further explanation regarding the evidence was released as part of the announcement. The investigation received renewed attention in 2020 when the Georgia Bureau of Investigation created a cold case unit composed of retired agents. That renewed effort brought additional focus to long-standing unsolved cases, including the investigation into Renee Blackmore's death. The work of the unit preceded the arrest, announced in 2022, representing an important development in the decades-old case. As the case continues through the legal process, Marcellus McCluster is currently awaiting trial. That remains the latest confirmed public status of the investigation, concluding the documented timeline without additional speculation or unanswered claims.